Chapter 12. Threat of Expulsion. I ought to have seen it coming. The hunting parties were going farther and farther afield in search of animals for meat. They no longer returned at evening as before. Often it was 3, 4, or 5 days before they came back, weary and irritated at not having their fiber bags full of the longed-for meat. Our diet was deficient. We were living now on what we were invited to share, which was not much, because no one had anything much left over. Besides, it wasn't in us to accept food from those who had barely enough for themselves. Nor was it fitting to beg just because a friend happened to have had a successful hunt. The savant reckons that warriors and all adults should be able to sustain themselves unaided, however adverse circumstances may be, and I considered I had the privilege of having been accepted into that category. If impelled by desperation during that period of hunger, I had flatly asked for food. The confidence the savants showed in me would have ceased. We measured our physical resources and took care of our health. We made do each day with a handful of beans, each which we boiled in plenty of water so as to have the stock for use later, 2 handfuls of toasted corn, maize, and a few coconuts. From time to time we accepted the gift of a small wild pumpkin, or the rare present of small but tasty potatoes, which we ate in their skins so as to appreciate their full flavor, or as a special treat, a fresh, delicious palm shoot. And we took our few remaining calcium tablets. To repay the offers of food, we depended upon the few things we had not already given away at present: fishhooks, combs, and mirrors. Thus the savant never raised any objections, and we were able to preserve our dignity unimpaired in his eyes. It was useless to try to hunt a specimen of game for ourselves. The expenditure of energy was not justified by the hypothetical result. Hunger troubled us, but not to the extent one might imagine. Our physical constitution did not experience any feverish desperation to obtain food. We were not greatly troubled by having to subsist on such diminutive rations, perhaps because we had become inured to shortage, and our constitutions were weakened, or very possibly because the fascinating interest which the tribe aroused in us at every moment acted like a psychological sedative. As for our moral make-up, we enjoyed an excellent disposition in which intolerance and bad temper had no place. Norma's gaiety, her undaunted spirit when things went wrong, and the children who came to see us helped me a great deal. We never lost sight of the evident precariousness of our situation and the tragic and unthinkable end it might lead to even yet, but we did not allow ourselves to dwell upon it. I had learnt that whenever these savant women spent the evening and part of the night crushing maize in their pestles to make loaves of bread, it meant that the tribe was preparing for something unusual. Occasionally the witch doctor passed judgment on some issue without consulting the tribal council. This was one of those occasions, and the importance of his private decision was to shake the life of the village to the roots. Dawn was breaking. I was so used to the comings and goings of the Indians and to their whisperings, I hardly paid attention this time to what my wife was saying to me. The infernal hammock had given me, as usual, a wretched night. I knew that if I opened an eye, Norma would speak to me. To dispel her enthusiasm, I pretended to snore. At last I had to listen to her, or run the risk of being tipped out of the hammock onto the floor. She told me that all night long captains and other members of the tribe had been coming and going, and what was more extraordinary, they had been having their morning meal before dawn. As soon as I was fully awake, I caught the odor of something burning. Norma went outside, only to come in again immediately to tell me that the witch doctor was setting fire to the hut next door. Without stopping to put on my shoes, I rushed outside with my wife, each of us with a film camera. When I had got the lenses ready, the huge hut of dried palm leaves was burning like a great crackling funeral pyre, which in a matter of seconds was razed to the ground. The witch doctor, a pock-marked little odd man, carried away by his destructive mania, was running amok like a lunatic with a flaming brand in his hand. When he came to another hut, a group of women blocked his way, while others nimbly climbed onto the dwelling and started taking down the leaves, as it is the women who have to gather the palm leaves for the huts. They were trying to salvage the leaves from the fire. The old man freed himself from the arms of the shouting women, and like an avenging demon applied the torch to the straw. As if it had been sprinkled with petrol, the maloca caught fire with fantastic rapidity. The women who were removing the leaves dropped to the ground and, pushing, shoving, and screaming, entered the burning hut to try to bring out their belongings. Meanwhile, the warriors stood aside, calm and indifferent, as though what was happening had nothing to do with them. They laughed at their womenfolk, but they made no move to help them. The witch doctor did not have to put himself out to go the rounds of the 22 huts. The wind blew burning twigs and leaves to the huts that were still intact, and in a few minutes they too were converted into smoking ruins. Norma reminded me of our equipment in the hut, which I had forgotten in my enthusiasm to film the scene. We ran back to rescue it. Fortunately, it was relatively tidily packed, but we had great difficulty in getting it out. The women with their household effects were blocking the only doorway. Just as I went back to fetch the hammocks, a burning leaf stuck to the roof as if it were made of liquid fire. The dome of the hut burst into flames. I took down my carbine and gave a tug at the knot of the cords which tied the hammock to a post. Nothing happened. I seized the rope with both hands and pulled. With the same result, I clapped my hand to my belt for my knife, and it wasn't there. When I had got up so hurriedly, I had left it in one of the bags. The smoke that penetrated through the roof was making me cough. The hut must have had the temperature of an oven. I ran outside, grabbed the knife, and went in again. In a few seconds, I was enveloped in smoke, my eyes streaming, almost unable to see. I hacked frantically at the ropes, got the hammocks free, and dashed out through the arched doorway, which was now burning fiercely. The next moment, the main beam of the roof collapsed. I was expecting recriminations from Norma on my imprudence. I was surprised to notice that the hairs on my arm, parts of my eyelids, eyebrows, and a tuft of hair had been singed. The women were still striving among burning branches and leaves, which were being blown perilously in all directions, to drag out of their huts and away from the greed of the flames, mats, bags, and baskets. At the end of a few minutes, a scene of desolation met our eyes. The busy, proud parent village, which had been situated in that spot for more than 15 years, renowned, feared, and respected, and written of in books and reports, had perished in a holocaust like a burnt offering to tradition. Voluntarily and with complete suddenness, these savants were embracing once more the life of the nomadic warrior, because the zone in which they lived was not providing them with what they needed for their sustenance. Dense clouds of smoke rose from where the enormous Moluccas had once proudly stood. Scattered over the ground were heaps of large baskets, rolled mats, great piles of dried palm leaves, and anything else that was of any value to the savant. Complying with some behest of which we knew nothing, the women, literally covered with leaves, advanced in a line, all in the same direction. Ahead of them, a small group of warriors had set out as scouts, followed by a contingent of heavily armed warriors, whose mouths were painted black. These were the men who were to cover the column's advance. Groups of warriors went along beside the whole interminable line, their weapons at the ready. We had not yet recovered from the stupefaction that the incredible and historic event had produced in us, and had just finished filming it, so we sat down on our equipment to wait for the chief. We had 5 large bundles of stuff, which were the cross we had to bear. Now, to our worries about our uncertain future had to be added a new and more immediate problem. Who's going to carry the material? I was wrestling with this problem when the chief and his escort came up. He had 6 warriors with him. Good, one more than I needed to transport our material. When I put my problem to him, he was perplexed. He was not counting on anything quite like this. He suggested that Norma, not I, should carry 2 bundles. It was natural for the woman to carry the man's things. When I convinced him that that was impossible and against the commandments of the white tribe, he gave an order. The chief's escort made him repeat the instructions twice before they obeyed. They were all warriors chosen for their bravery, and to have to carry our luggage was an insult to their pride. They looked desperately around for some Indian woman or warrior lagging behind. Finally, they slung their bundles of arrows and their spears over their shoulders, keeping the bow and 3 arrows in one hand. I breathed a sigh of relief. I had already begun to see myself once again sorting out what was absolutely indispensable and leaving the rest behind. The chief made us walk between his escort and himself, and we set off behind the rest of the tribe. The pace of these avants is rapid, but this time they slackened it in case the woman should see them carrying our bundles, which suited Norma very well. The day seemed to be sharing in the general melancholy, for once the sun did not shine, I thought we would go on till sunset. I underestimated the tribe's practical common sense. We had not been walking for 4 hours when the warriors roughly dropped our bundles and strode on. The thought struck me that they were disobeying the chief because their self-respect was wounded. It was not so. Some 200 yards farther on, half hidden in the forest, the tribe was encamped. The warriors were hastening forward to join their womenfolk to assist in the transfer of the tribe's equipment to the new site. The new camp was a hive of activity. As far as my eyes could see, there were the skeletons of small family dwellings, some already half covered with palm leaves. Some women were busy clearing the ground, carrying away in mats the weeds and shrubs which were in the way. On one side, 4 warriors were devoting their attention to the lighting of a fire, which would afterwards be used to provide all the families with a flame to light their own. Further on, in the foothills of a massif of the Serra do Roncador, one could distinguish warriors on watch. The sentinels were already guarding the nascent village. The women made interminable journeys to where the chichu palm trees grew, bringing back the shiny green leaves to thatch the dwellings. I suppose this camp to be transitory, and I could not understand this methodical laboriousness. With hunger, exhaustion after the long trek, and the nervous strain which the conflagration in the village had caused, I had little inclination for building any sort of shelter for the night. As if this disinclination on my part were an invitation to further adversity, it began to rain intermittently. This was the first time that the long spell of the dry season had been interrupted, just when the designs of a nomadic tribe had deprived us of a shelter. We covered ourselves inadequately with plastic sheets, and mumbling all sorts of pessimistic comments, we ate the only food we had left from our bartering with the Indians, a handful of toasted maize, which we divided into 2 equal shares. As night came on, the stars twinkled above 100 savant fires. I took advantage of the light to fix 4 poles, which I had trimmed when the rain stopped, and to spread out over them the thin, slippery plastic, using our spare clothing as curtains. When our makeshift hut was finished, and we surveyed it by the firelight, we laughed loud and long at the absurdity of it. The savants were friendly to us, but they did not see any necessity to demonstrate the fact by effective assistance. That I was allowed to attend meetings of the tribal council did not mean they should offer me food or collaborate in any work I might be doing. Since they were self-sufficient, it never struck them that we might need anything from them. It was an honor that this should be so, but it posed an insoluble problem for me. This was what I was thinking about as I summed up with my eyes the smooth dark green trunk of a chichao palm tree. These trees were an essential part of the savant's life, and they were going to be of ours too. The tree must have been 40 feet high and had to be climbed if one wanted to cut the branches and gather the leaves to provide a roof over one's head. The tribe was to stay in the new camp for several days. There would be many council meetings, many deliberations yet, before they made up their minds where they were going. I assumed that in a few days the food situation would improve and that plentiful meat would give us new energy. I was mistaken and was misjudging the savant character. The advance of the tribe would be conducted with perfect warlike coordination to prevent any surprises. Their yearning for meat would remain a secondary matter compared with the safety of the tribe, and I would have to adapt myself as best I could to going hungry a bit longer, as existence in the jungle without elementary necessities is one long unremitting struggle. I opted for our comfort. I would build a hut. The zeal which had led me to follow the women who came back covered with chichao leaves, and later at finding clumps of these trees growing in profusion, I stopped short as I took in the height of them and the girth of their trunks. I tried to cut into a trunk with my machete. At the first blow I gave up. The ringing sound of the steel blade on the dense, fibrous bark and the vibration that jolted my wrist were more eloquent than the best advice. I did not even consider climbing that erect and polished trunk. Some giggling made me turn around. 2 girls from the group of my wife's friends, not more than 13 years of age, were covering their mouths so as not to offend me. I laughed with them at my own helplessness, and the ill humor that had begun to take hold of me evaporated. One of them asked me for the machete. She cut an invera. After rolling it up with amazing dexterity, she knotted it and wrapped some round the toes and instep of each foot. She put the heavy machete between her teeth and scaled the tree trunk with an expression of roguish self-confidence. In a few seconds she was way up in the tree, while her companion burst out laughing at me and stood aside. The girl in the tree cut away the branches with skillful sweeps of the knife, and soon had enough to roof almost the whole hut. She climbed down and, handing me back the machete, began to open out the leaves and arrange them to form large compact bundles. She got under one of these, and as her head emerged, she lifted them into the air. She made signs to me to do the same. I tried, but once I got myself underneath the pile, I could not get my head out anyhow. There was always a branch or something in the way, so I picked up the leaves in a great armful. The other girl took the pile that was left over, and I set off at a swaying pace, stumbling continually, dropping the leaves and slithering and falling as I stepped on them. I had to stop several times to rest and get my breath back. When we reached the end of our journey, the girls were waiting for me, smiling and fresh as daisies, in spite of having carried bundles as large as mine. Making use of tokura canes, invera for tying, and chichao leaves, as well as a small tree that stood within the perimeter of the site that served as a firm support, we constructed our dwelling. It was completely different from those of the savants, for it was shaped like a big rectangular box with a flat roof and minimum of slope for letting the water run off, such economies being dictated by the shortage of leaves. We had to stoop to enter, and once inside had to change our position continually. At the back we had no option but to kneel. The scarcity of the chichao branches had made it necessary to restrict the height. Even so, the blessed leaves barely sufficed to cover all the roof, and once more we had to recourse to our equipment and used some of the plastic sheet as walls. We covered the floor with a very soft, tender leaf of a dwarf palm, which the Indians call elchu, which is similar to tuku, but without prickles. My delight when we finished the job must have been similar to what Stone Age man felt when he discovered the way to make a hut and leave the shelter of the caves. I think the savants must have felt a new sense of self-satisfaction, too, when they saw our residents standing within the precincts of their campsite, but so different from their own huts. Warriors and whole families whom we did not even know by sight came our way out of sheer curiosity. Some stopped, and others, those with whom we had any dealings, would touch the poles or even peep inside. When they found that it was held up in one corner by a small tree, they laughed more and more, and the hilarity increased when those who were our friends went inside and found they had to stoop. Alray showed no inclination either to make fun or express admiration. He surveyed our hut earnestly from end to end. He pointed to the walls, which were bare of covering, and to the roof, which was overladen with leaves. The Indians preferred to cover the walls thoroughly and leave a hole in the dome of the roof to let the smoke out. Such a hole was the same as sleeping in the fresh air. It was made so large in family dwellings in the dry season. I explained to him that later on I would fetch more leaves for the walls, but I was too tired just then and needed rest. He said nothing and went away. Shortly afterwards, a little girl brought us another load of leaves. It was his wife, that child who was not yet of age to fulfill all the functions of a married woman. Like the members of the tribe, we experienced in our own persons what the struggle for existence meant. I got to know very well why the nomadic hunter has neither time nor energy to exert his mind in things spiritual and artistic. All his efforts are directed to keeping alive, that is to say, to hunting for food. Every morning we had to dry the blankets and equipment because of life in a confined space and intimate contact with chiku leaves. We always got up wet. Then came the fetching of water and firewood. By that time the sun was high and strong. That was the time for our physical salvation. We stretched ourselves out in the sun for a few minutes to get warm and dry, and to assimilate vitamins to counter the cold in the night, which filtered through the innumerable slits in the hut walls. We then had our travesty of a lunch, a handful or two of beans, maize, and coconuts, and then we took a siesta. During that brief rest, our energies reached 0 point. Writing or doing anything useful was out of the question. We would comment upon events or make plans, but without that burning zeal that had urged me forward in the beginning. I had a sort of inkling now that the normal appearance of our sensations was deceptive, like a mirage, and that our bodies were going to fail us at any moment. When the sun's rays no longer beat down so directly and intensely upon us, we went hunting. Hunting is just a word, and that's all it remained to us. When, half dead with exhaustion, we returned to the hut empty-handed. At that hour, the little boys came to see us, those who were still at the stage of warrior apprentices, and their chattering gaiety was as good as a tonic to us. When the dance of evening began, from which I had to excuse myself in order not to be obliged to expend energy I could not spare, we would go the rounds of the hundreds of family malokas, visiting the savants who showed us friendship or interest. Now that they could receive us in their private quarters and not in the great huts of the whole clan, our visits had taken on a more ceremonial aspect, which was greatly to the liking of the householders. The small malokas were grouped in twos and threes. It depended on how numerous the family unit was, but invariably husband and wife alone shared one of them. As we approached them at this twilight hour, we had to do so with great care. From the ground, which had been cleared by fire, treacherous tree stumps projected, and we had to reckon with the Indian dogs. They could smell us from a long way off, and they attacked with the speed of lightning. I leave it to some competent zoologist to investigate this peculiar breed of dogs. I could not find out to what strain they belonged. Their bodies resembled those of greyhounds or whippets, but their heads were much more prominent, and they had very strong jaws. I have only seen dogs like them in the Canaries, where I was told that they dated them before the discovery of the islands. Could they have sprung from dogs brought to South America by the Spanish and Portuguese conquerors? When we reached the space where the family fire was burning, which was outside owing to the smallness of the huts and the consequent danger of fire, the women hastened to smother Norma with hugs and embraces amid good-natured giggling. The men remained seated around the fire. No sooner did I mention visiting the hut itself, however, than the warrior would smile, and with the best of goodwill tear off a palm leaf from the roof and set fire to it to use as a torch to light our way inside. He would invite us to sit on a mat and settle himself beside us while his wife hovered attentively. My interest in his implements, necklaces, and ornaments was matched by his eagerness to show them to me. He made his wife take down from their pegs beautiful little baumeries and took out of them deer hooves decorated with red and iridescent aurora feathers, very long necklaces made of the seeds of a rare fruit, bodkins of animal bone for sewing with wild cotton, little hollowed gourds filled with coconut oil, belts, bracelets, and bands for wrists and ankles, piranha teeth sharpened like razors, and a kind of white powder extracted from some tree and used for scenting and embellishing certain ritual adornments. If by chance he came across one of these hoods of vegetable matter used for covering the male sexual organ, he hid it at once, while his wife covered her mouth so that she should not be seen to be amused. At every sign of admiration for his neat and meticulous work, he became somewhat bashful and proceeded to search more diligently in the basket. After showing me his belongings, he stood waiting. I did not keep him waiting long. My desire to know all about his possessions was no mere formal compliment. When I pointed to his bow and arrows, he handed them to me. He said nothing to me about how finely the bow was constructed or how well the string was plaited, nor weighed the arrows or the spear to show their excellent balance. He simply gave them to me to examine. It was a moment of eager expectation for him and for me. If I had committed the error of glancing superficially at them, saying something to the effect that I liked them and nothing more, he would have despised my stupidity in not appreciating the qualities of the weapons. With profound earnestness, therefore, I spent a long time deliberating upon the toughness and elasticity of the bow, the firmness of the string, and upon how compactly it was plaited, and upon how straight the arrows were, the direction of the feathers, and the sharpness of the point. When I returned the weapons to him, a proud smile hovered about the warrior's lips. Then he inquired about my bow, the carbine, and my arrows, the cartridges. I showed him the mechanism, and although he didn't understand, he emitted a kindly of approbation. Meanwhile, Norma was busily satisfying feminine curiosity, which was interested particularly in her clothing and most of all in the inexplicable mysteries of her undergarments. When we came away from the hut, we left behind us a firmer or a new friendship, and also some little gift as a souvenir. In return, they gave us beautifully fashioned arrows, implements, or personal adornments. On our return to the hut, I always brought with me a palm leaf, some branches, or a young tree. My civilized mentality was always on the lookout for some means of reinforcing our flimsy dwelling and dispelling the troublesome draughts that caused us to get up 2 or 3 times in the night, stiff with cold, to warm ourselves by our campfire. The pronounced and peculiar shape of our hut had gradually changed as a result of our continual additions of heterogeneous forms of vegetation. Its manifest lack of elegance convinced us that it must be the most awkward-looking hut that had ever been constructed in the jungle. I was cutting some branches one day when suddenly I heard a loud buzzing sound, and a dense ball of something seemed to spring from the young tree, stretching and expanding as the buzzing increased. Wasps. I acted as quickly as they, and although I got off lightly, I had to endure intense pain for 2 days from the 3 stings. To have the stings extracted, I went to Prena's wife. Her skill and eyesight were extraordinary. In one moment she removed them using only her fingers. I imagined that and the application of an ointment with the Benadryl base, which I strongly recommend for any non-poisonous stings, would be the end of the unfortunate affair. I had no reason to suspect that there would be any important consequences, much less that they would be so dramatic as was destined to be the case. One of the 3 nightly gatherings of the tribe, I preferred that of the married warriors with children, who were the most settled and discerning Indians. With the exception of the captains, the loyalty of their friendship was equaled only by their courageous and respectful attitude towards tribal traditions. My inclination was guided to a certain extent by circumstances. At the meeting of young warriors I was not welcome. They did not refuse me admittance, but their reluctance to tolerate one who was a stranger to the tribe, and their impatience to embark upon warlike incursions, produced an atmosphere that was not pleasant. To obviate this mutual embarrassment, I preferred to attend their meetings as little as possible. As for the sessions of the tribal council, there were a number of reasons why I often stayed away. The main one was that I had to be invited. The others were secondary reasons, but very important to me. When I took my place on the deerskin mat of the Council of Elders, I had to endure the unfeigned antipathy of 3 of its members. That little old man who had demanded that we be put to death, and had not changed his mind, a brother of the chief, a man of frigid aspect, and the witch doctor. These 3 never lost any opportunity of showing their scorn for me. The other elders showed nothing worse than indifference to me, and the captains, all except Sirupre, the tribe's avenger, displayed the same aloofness. With Sirupre it was different. He seemed to be friendly, which I think was due to the influence of the chief, to whom he was extremely loyal. When, on the next occasion, I had to occupy my place in the circle of elders, I made up my mind to try to grasp the meaning of their proceedings. One was expressing his opinion as to the best place for a great hunting expedition. Then another, the head of the clan, proposed a future marriage, which was turned down after lengthy consultation with Sirupre, who was officiating as the unwritten law of the tribe, because the youngsters concerned, 3 and 5 years old, were too closely related. I only understood a little, but it was enough to follow the gist of the speeches. Besides, I knew that when I was present at the meetings, they would not talk about interesting future plans, such as when we should leave the encampment, where we should go to, or when we should have plentiful supplies of meat again. I did not realize that the little old man, who showed so much hatred of us, was talking about me when I saw him stand up. The chief called me to attention and explained to me, spacing his words carefully and repeating them, what the old savant had been saying. He had angrily affirmed that I had 3 wasp stings, and therefore I must be expelled from the tribe. Then I learnt that wasps were evil spirits, and if they attacked 3 times, the victim of their stings would bring misfortune on all those around him. I had no inclination to smile. The accusation was too serious. Then charges against me followed, one after another. I was being asked why I wanted savant bows and arrows if I did not use them. That could mean nothing good for the tribe. The old man had blamed me for the lack of game, and finally, and gravest charge of all, I had been accused of having caused the recent illness of a relative, a valiant captain who was to have directed the next Waya. This warrior, according to what the old man had said, had been ill since our arrival. He had added roundly that no one could have wished ill to befall the best hunter in the tribe now that it was enduring a period of hunger, except me. Every face was grave and earnest, including the chief's. Then the witch doctor took charge of the investigation. This time I did understand. He was demanding for the good of the tribe that I leave at once. I believed that the chief would absolve me from these charges, but I was basing my hopes on my goodwill towards them, not on concrete facts. When I heard the chief's words, I suffered a severe disillusionment. He gave me 5 sons, one hand held up, to get my things ready and go. He would provide an escort as far as the river, and he advised me never again to set foot on Zavant soil. Indignation impelled me to speak. I exclaimed that if the young warrior got better, that would prove what they were saying about me was not true. The chief had no hesitation in accepting the challenge. The sinister smile on the face of the little old man told me that the warrior must be suffering from an incurable malady. Suddenly I shuddered at the imprudence I had committed. If the warrior were to die, would they not blame me? I had been wrong to take so great a chance. I had thought, too, the chief would attach no credence to what the old man said, and I had been wrong in that. Would they let us go if the warrior died? Had I not better call the whole thing off and prepare to leave? These were the kind of questions that tormented me all night. We were playing with fire, a fact which I had forgotten so long as I enjoyed the friendship of the tribe. Through the palm leaves of the hut I seemed to see, in the blackness of the interminable night, the long procession of the dead, all the many known to have been killed by Savant warriors. My examination of the patient dismayed me. A purulent eczema covered his thighs on the inside and part of his abdomen. His nails, with continual scratching, were spreading the infection. He was prostrate on a mat, and not so much exhausted physically as spiritually. He was being tended by his wife, a graceful girl with soft eyes and attractive features, different in appearance from most Savant women, who are generally of heavy, vigorous build. During my visit he spoke of nothing but the hunting expeditions that were approaching, and of his inability to take part in them. When I pointed out to him that he ought not to scratch himself, he applied his nails to his irritations more savagely and drew blood. I had nothing more to say. I understood his desperation. I smeared a sulfonamide ointment on the affected parts, and he raised no objection. When I met Norma afterwards, I put it to her as gently as I could that it was time we left the tribe. When she heard the reason, she shook with anger. I was ready to believe that she was on the point of going to confront the chief himself. All her righteous indignation was vented upon poor Prena, who dropped in to see us. Prena already stood in manifest awe of the female sex. Harassed by my wife, he explained to us the ritual of the wasps. The ceremony culminated when warriors provided with sacred arrows rounded up at dawn 3 men who, with buzzing noises, pretended to be angry wasps, and put them to death symbolically to drive away that particular kind of evil spirits. It was P.O.G., his consort, who, in all innocence, had told of my stings. Evening came. It was the day after the Council of Elders had set a rigid term to my stay in the camp. I had just been dressing the sick warrior's sores, and as usual, as I passed by, I was about to call at Prenah's hut. As soon as he saw me coming, he left the Moloko with an earnest expression on his face, urged me to leave the campsite without halting my walk. P.O.G., his wife, was less diplomatic. She turned her back on me and emitted a loud clicking of the tongue in token of displeasure. Not knowing what to think, I went to break the news to Norma, but she had already been warned by a woman friend when she went to fetch water. That evening I decided that we would not make the usual tour of the huts until the situation returned to normal. After supper I took a precaution which made me feel safer. Not that it would in fact have been much help. I placed my revolver under the large bag that I used as a pillow, and spread dry twigs around outside so as to be able to hear any approaching footsteps. Then I watched the hours go by, unable to sleep. The slightest noise roused me. I sat up with a start and listened so intently that my pounding heart and my breathing drowned every external sound. If the savants themselves who fell into disgrace suffered the penalty of death prescribed by the tribal code, we certainly could not hope to escape that rigid decree if in the eyes of the Council of Elders we were a danger to the village, and anybody who showed friendliness or sympathy towards us would suffer the same fate. Such were the reflections that I harped upon involuntarily until the dawn light announced a new day. On the second and third days we were left strictly alone. The only one who dared to greet me and talk a little was Fabre. I felt no resentment towards Prena, our constant friend, his situation being, as he was a member of the chief's clan, a most delicate one. As compensation for this isolation, we always found our canvas buckets filled with water and piles of wood for our fire. Unseen hands, perhaps Fabre's, and almost certainly Prena's, were supplying our needs under cover of darkness. The chief still visited us as usual and made no reference to the state of things that he himself had been responsible for creating. It was with an effort that I still smiled at him and treated him with deference. Norma could not suppress her ill humor, and this had the effect of inducing the Zavant chief to present us with a handful of string beans. Twice a day I treated the sick warrior with the antibiotic ointment in a way that could not be attributed to medical knowledge on my part. The stores dried up and began to disappear. I believe it was due to the fact that the man's system was virgin environment for civilization's panaceas that the cure was so effective as to seem miraculous. Anyway, to my infinite peace of mind, the improvement was a reality. When the chief saw the warrior, his approbation inspired him to pat me on the back several times, which convinced me that he too had been hoping for a happy outcome. The cure did away with the sword that had been hanging over my head. Nobody made any further reference to the affair. A few days later, the captain brought me a present in the form of a tiny, elegant woven bain-marie filled with small coconuts. He smiled at me and then, as if ashamed of this acknowledgment of his gratitude, walked away.